Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Knowledge. With all the secrecy and concealment within the novel, there arises a question of what is knowledge. Knowledge and the movability of what a person or a character in the novel knows changes considerably throughout the novel, and also the basis on which people consider that they have knowledge or that they have doubt varies from character to character. Eleanor is a character who tends to need to have a lot of evidence in order to believe that something is actually the case. In other words, in order to know that a certain situation pertains. Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood tend to require less tangible information in order to perceive a fact. Eleanor says early on in the novel, chapter 3, volume 1, chapter 3, she knew that what Marianne and her mother conjectured one moment, they believed the next, that with them to wish was to hope, and to hope was to expect. She tried to explain the real state of the case to her sister. So we see here, already very early on in the novel, a divergence between the level of evidence that Marianne requires in order to know something or to believe that it's the case, and the level of real tangible evidence that Eleanor needs. And this continues, of course, throughout the affair with Willoughby. Mrs. Dashwood believes from Marianne and Willoughby's behaviour together that there must be an engagement. She goes by appearances, not by the actual fact that Willoughby has asked her for Marianne's hand in marriage, that he's made a public declaration of that being his intention. Where nothing has been said, Eleanor feels a considerable level of doubt that they are engaged. And there's some interplay between doubt and probabilities around the concept of knowledge. And we'll be able to see a little bit of that. So in chapter 15, volume 1, chapter 15, there's a conversation between Eleanor and her mother in which Eleanor is urging her mother to find out from Marianne whether or not there is an understanding with Willoughby, because she thinks that there are sort of risks in Marianne continuing to nurse an affection for Willoughby if that's not the case, and also engaging with Willoughby in a sort of public way, corresponding, if there is no actual understanding. Eleanor says, not entirely. It may be proper to conceal their engagement, if they are engaged, from Mrs. Smith, and if that is the case, it must be highly expedient for Willoughby to be but little in Devonshire at present. But this is no excuse for their concealing it from us. Concealing it from us? My dear child, do you accuse Willoughby and Marianne of concealment? This is strange indeed, when your eyes have been reproaching them every day for incautiousness. I want no proof of their affection, said Eleanor, but of their engagement I do. I am perfectly satisfied of both. Yet not a syllable has been said to you on the subject by either of them. I have not wanted syllables where actions have spoken so plainly. Has not his behaviour to Marianne and to all of us for at least the last fortnight declared that he loved and considered her as his future wife, and that he felt for us the attachment of the nearest relation? Have we not perfectly understood each other? Has not my consent been daily asked by his looks, his manner, his attentive and affectionate respect? My Eleanor, is it possible to doubt their engagement? How could such a thought occur to you? How is it to be supposed that Willoughby, persuaded as he must be of your sister's love, should leave her, and leave her perhaps for months, without telling her of his affection? That they should part without a mutual exchange of confidence? I confess, replied Eleanor, that every circumstance except one is in the favour of their engagement, but that one is the total silence of both on the subject, and with me it almost outweighs every other. So, for Mrs. Dashwood, although an engagement was actually a formal contract entered into by two unmarried people, where there has been no formality even of the spoken word here between Eleanor and Marianne, it is actually very imprudent of her, really somewhat irresponsible of her to imagine that there is an engagement just because appearances suggest that there has been. And it is leading Marianne into a difficult situation from which conceivably there might not have been a return because of the standards of the day required of young women. Mrs. Dashwood goes so far as to call Eleanor ungracious girl, but I require no such proof. As it turns out, of course, Mrs. Dashwood is in the wrong. She's erroneous in her suppositions, and Eleanor and her ungraciousness are ultimately vindicated. I mean, knowledge is sometimes as well sort of discussed in more trivial terms, more shallow terms, although the underlying need for knowledge is actually quite important. When Marianne asks Sir John Middleton about Willoughby, what he's really like, Sir John Middleton bases it all on the fact that Willoughby's a good rider and that he's got a particularly nice pointer dog, whereas Marianne is actually trying to discover about the shades of Willoughby's mind. And again, the knowledge that is exchanged is very superficial. The actual tangible knowledge is at the superficial level, and it's not possible to know who Willoughby really is. Marianne, how does she know? She's trying to judge by Willoughby's behaviour, but Willoughby's behaviour is false. And throughout the novel, this question arises of how can we know who the people that surround us, how can we know who they are? These people whom we meet every day, with whom we engage every day. We can observe them, but we don't actually know. We can only know people by each individual action as it happens. And this is perhaps why proofs of people's intentions, such as an actual engagement, are very important. There are other ways in which knowledge functions in the story. For example, Mrs. Palmer, when she's asked about Willoughby, says that she knows Willoughby terribly well because he lives near to them, which is probably a different estate about 30 miles away. In point of fact, she's never met him, but because he lives near to her, she says that she's met him. Again, her standards of the level of reality that accords with what she says is knowledge is rather different, definitely and distinctly from Eleanor's. Mrs. Palmer as well spreads the rumour in London that Marianne is engaged. In fact, Colonel Brandon comes to the house where Marianne and Eleanor are staying, convinced that this is actually the case. So in chapter 20, Eleanor is trying to find something out about Willoughby because she's very concerned about the situation with regard to Marianne, and Marianne obviously languishing for Willoughby by this stage. she's speaking to Mrs. Palmer, she began by inquiring if they saw much of Mr. Willoughby at Cleveland, and whether they were intimately acquainted with him. "Oh dear, yes, I know him extremely well," replied Mrs. Palmer. "Not that I ever spoke to him, indeed, but I have seen him for ever in town. Somehow or other I never happened to be staying at Barton while he was at Allenham. Mamma saw him here once before, but I was with my uncle at Weymouth. However, I dare say we should have seen a great deal of him in Somersetshire if it had not happened very unluckily that we should never have been in the country together. He is very little at Combe, I believe, but if he were ever so much there, I do not think Mr. Palmer would visit him, for he is in the opposition, you know, and besides it is such a way off. I know why you inquire about him very well. Your sister is to marry him. I am monstrous glad of it, for then I shall have her for a neighbour, you know." "Upon my word," replied Eleanor, "you know much more of the matter than I do, if you have any reason to expect such a match. Don't pretend to deny it, because you know it is what everybody talks of. I assure you I heard of it in my way through town." "My dear Mrs. Palmer." "Upon my honour I did. I met Colonel Brandon Monday morning in Bond Street, just before we left town, and he told me of it directly." "You surprise me very much. Colonel Brandon tell you of it? Surely you must be mistaken. To give such intelligence to a person who could not be interested in it, even if it were true, is not what I should expect Colonel Brandon to do." "But I do assure you it was so, for all that, and I will tell you how it happened. When we met him, he turned back and walked with us, and so we began talking of my brother and sister, and one thing and another, and I said to him, 'So, Colonel Brandon, there is a new family come to Barton Cottage, I hear, and Mamma sends me word that they are very pretty, and that one of them is going to be married to Mr. Willoughby of Combe Magna. Is it true, pray? For, of course, you must know, as you have been in Devonshire so lately.' And what did the Colonel say?" "Oh, he did not say much, but he looked as if he knew it to be true. So from that moment I set it down as certain. It will be quite delightful, I declare. When is it to take place?" So there we have a sort of quite clear contrast, really, in how facts are transmitted. This isn't fact, it's simply gossip. But, you know, frequently the novel is dealing in these terms, that some things are stated as gossip, as being knowledge, and some things are doubtful, they haven't been clearly stated, and yet they're regarded as being fact. Some things are merely wished or hoped for, and that turns them into a fact. Some things are not hoped for, and that turns them into a fact. So Fanny Dashwood and Mrs. Ferrars both believe that Eleanor is likely to marry Edward Ferrars if they don't put as many barriers up to stop it as possible. Eleanor herself, in the meantime, knows perfectly well that Edward is actually engaged to Lucy Steele, with whom Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny Dashwood are extremely friendly at the time. And Eleanor, of course, wonders what the state of their relationship would be if they knew that she was actually engaged to Edward. They don't know. They want Edward not to marry Eleanor, therefore she is the threat. They don't have any ideas about Lucy marrying Edward, therefore she's not a threat. So again, this is, the information is there, the information is available within the world of the novel, that there are certain facts, but they are concealed either through secrecy or just through the veil of that we can't be in all places, in all times, and all-knowing. But together with the concealment and the secrecy, the whole realm of what counts as knowledge, what is knowledge, and how do we know that we have knowledge, or that we're actually in a state of doubt, is something that the novel debates and really ultimately draws no conclusions on.